right, we've got 30 minutes. I'm going to put us on a 30-minute clock to discuss both divisions in the SEC. You up for it?
Sure.
All right, 30 minutes on the SEC East and West. We're going to rank how we feel the East and the West are going to shake out at the end of the season. I think a lot of people like to discuss this. It's a pretty easy talking point for us because we talk so much about the SEC and we're pretty familiar with it. So let's get it started. Maybe not your whole ranking, but who do you have dead last in the SEC East for 2018?
Dead last in the SEC East, I have somewhat of a tie between Tennessee and Vanderbilt.
Okay. Tennessee fans aren't going to want to hear that because of their hire in Pruitt. And if y'all listen to our earlier coaching discussions, we talked about how it's a lot easier, especially if you want to start hot, have a great first year. It's a lot easier to come in as an offensive coach. Maybe long-term build, slow burn, crescendo, defensive coach is the way to go. But you think Pruitt at Tennessee, if you have it tied, Tennessee and Vanderbilt, and hopefully not because you're just looking at the SEC East standings and that's alphabetically where they are at right now, and there's more to it, is that a reflection on Tennessee as they're at their head coaching position when that change in Pruitt, or is it just they're so depleted in talent and they are starting at the bottom and that's where they are now, and that's where you think it's going to shake out?
It's definitely the latter. Tennessee, from a talent perspective, is just not on par with the rest of the SEC, and it's kind of confusing how they got to this level. But when you look down the roster, I mean, offensively, it's hard to see who they have that's a real legitimate threat, frankly. I mean, Callaway shows flashes of being a really good receiver, and then he just kind of falls off. And the guys last year that really made an impact, John Kelly and Ethan Wolf, are gone. And they had a fantastic returner in Evan Berry, probably the best in the conference, and he's gone. So it's kind of hard to see where they're going to get points, honestly. And then the offensive line has a couple good players, but there's the right side of the line has holes. And then defensively, honestly, almost across the board, they're just not that talented. And they have some guys that, have potential. When you talk about guys like Kongbo that was really heavily recruited, and he just, more than anything, I think hasn't bulked up to where he needs to be able to hold on the defensive line. And they have a lot of guys like Kirkland and Tuttle that have been really banged up that maybe they can turn around, but it's been hard for them to deal with their consistent injury issues. They got a lot of problems. Now, one thing I will say with Tennessee, and it makes me hesitant, I say they're kind of tied with Vanderbilt, and it's the thing that could turn them around is the Keller Christ at quarterback. I do think personally Chris will probably end up winning the job. We were really not very high on Garantano last year, and it's easy to say that he's a high potential guy. I haven't seen the consistency passing that you're going to need to be good with him. I mean, he went 1-5 last year, and losing to a South Carolina team that honestly probably they should have beaten. So I think Chris could come in, and if I'm right on that, this is sort of the flip side. If I'm right that I don't think Garantano is the future at quarterback, the flip side to it is that, well, that means that if you get a guy like Kristen that actually ends up being a pretty darn good quarterback, it could be a much bigger impact than you expect because maybe you don't realize how much the quarterback has been holding you back to this point. So I think that's really the one wild card that could take Tennessee somewhere that people aren't expecting. But outside of Christ and the quarterback situation, Pruitt's just going to have to take a couple years to really build up some talent on that roster for them to be competitive.
Yeah, and we've actually never been that high on Christ either, and that speaks volumes about where we are with the rest of that quarterback room, in that I don't think he's great, and I still think he's going to win the job, which is pretty interesting. Here's why you're right on Tennessee, and here's why I think you can go ahead and slate them for last place. First of all, this isn't a slam on Tennessee. They were 4-8 last year. They were 4-8. They're depleted in talent. It's pretty clear. I think Pruitt is a great hire long term. Like you, he doesn't. If you bring in a defensive guy, he's not going to do something like scheme wise that's going to neutralize a talent gap that you might get to cheat and steal a couple of wins because you're spreading them around and you're doing all that. Defensive guys you hire them for the long term. So Tennessee fans need to be patient. But listen to this. Okay, they opened the season with West Virginia. I think that's a loss. I don't think that's ridiculous. Will Greer's running great wide receiver over there. I think West Virginia's going to win that game. They've got 2 layups, but then this is the middle of their schedule: Florida, Georgia, Auburn, Alabama, South Carolina. I mean, not only is it that they're all in a row, but your West draw is Auburn and Alabama. That sucks. Like they're like, can you please give us an Arkansas? And that wouldn't even be a gimme. But Florida, Georgia, Auburn, Alabama, South Carolina, right in a row. They very well could go 0-5 with that, and a 6 loss with West Virginia, which means they've got to win out 6-6. Win out on the other games to get to 6-6, which means they got to beat Kentucky, they got to beat Missouri, and they got to win at Vanderbilt. I actually think they might be a better team than Vanderbilt, but they just got a brutal middle stretch of their schedule, and that mentally can kind of weigh on a team and just be a killer.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, the reality of that, obviously you're going to play tough teams, but drawing Auburn out of the West was not good. A little of a spoiler, but Auburn's going to be pretty good. And then you take that and you put it in a block of 5 straight teams in a row, right? Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Auburn, South Carolina. It's just absolutely brutal. And it's very, very rare to see a team play 2 or 3. Basically, anytime you see a team play 3 top 25 teams in a row, they almost always drop one. It's just so hard to play at that level consistently for 3 weeks. If for no other reason than your starters get really banged up and beat up, and even if they're not, quote, injured, the reality is these guys are going to be covered with bruises, and they're just beat up when you come out of those games. That's the reality of the game of football. You do that for 5 straight weeks, and you play every one of those teams is going to have a little bit more rest than you. It's too much of a disadvantage. So as you said, they could be in a situation where they don't lose to any unranked teams, right? Every loss is to a ranked team. They even may beat a ranked team, and they could be 6-6 or 7-5, and that's just nuts.
So coming one step up, I'm going to give you my next 2. I think it's Kentucky, then Missouri. Both of them have a winnable game and I think guaranteed loss in their West draw. Manageable out of conference schedules. I think inside the SEC, I'm going to go. So if we're going what we've talked about to the bottom, I'm going to go Kentucky, Vanderbilt, then Tennessee, and then Missouri just ahead of Kentucky.
Right. I mean, I do it personally, just reverse. I put Vandy below Missouri. I think Missouri probably has the potential to have some offensive success. I personally will be surprised if both those teams have their coaches next year.
Yeah, I got Vanderbilt
Missouri
next to last. So next to last, right ahead of Tennessee.
Yeah. So I'll be surprised if they both have their coaches next year. I don't, Odom kind of turned it around at the end of last year. It's kind of hard to say how much of that was, scheduling related in terms of who they were playing and when they were playing and how that turned out and how much of it was really the team turning around. I think a little bit of it was the fact of how much they honestly just played without any effort or intensity for the first half of the season. And they won a few games, basically just won a couple games against Idaho and UConn, and decided that they wanted to play football again. But, also, Florida, Tennessee had given up, Arkansas had given up, Vanderbilt had given up. So that played into it too. And I think that resurgency is a little unjustified with Missouri. But that said, I'm with you. I think Vanderbilt, quite frankly, I don't think the Derek Mason hires turning out. They had an exceptionally disappointing season last year, and it's just I don't see any sign that it's going to be different. Quite frankly, this year, somebody has to win and somebody has to lose. every game. And in Vanderbilt's case, I think they're going to be losing more often than winning.
I'm not high on Webb or Shermer. I think there's a lot of love for Kyle Shermer that I don't see. And maybe it's because he's surrounded by not a lot of talent and he's always having to dig himself out of a hole. But I'm not that high on him either. So um, I, I think we're in kind of an agreement there. So where do you go next? I guess next stop above Missouri, who you got?
So next up above Missouri, I think I would go with South Carolina personally. I think that's not a maybe some South Carolina fans would see that as a dig. It's not. South Carolina getting Debo Samuel back will be big. That team's going to be very competitive, and I will say, South Carolina and Florida I have really close. Right now, I have Florida probably slightly ahead of South Carolina, and personally, I have it in tiers anyway. But I think South Carolina, I don't see them really turning the corner with Bentley in a consistency perspective. It's related to an earlier discussion we had. I don't think Bentley is a consistent quarterback fundamentally. I don't think he's going to become that way. I haven't seen enough to convince me that South Carolina has to be able to consistently move the ball and sort of top it all off. Their defense isn't dominant. And if you take those two things and put them together, it's just hard to take that next step. And so I have them being a very good team. I see them being a very competitive team. But you're not going to get better by losing Hayden Hurst and Sky Moore. And a lot of teams lose a lot of good players every year, and I get that. But when you're someone like South Carolina that doesn't have the depth of talent to draw from, it's a lot harder than it is for the Floridas and the Georgias of the world. And that's why I have Florida slightly ahead of South Carolina.
And it's interesting because South Carolina is everybody's kind of sexy pick. I think everyone is looking for somebody who can beat Georgia in the East. And look, I like South Carolina, and I was pretty high on them last year. I talked them up last year. I thought the bowl win was ugly but great. It was a great end note on the season. But I think people are reading too much into South Carolina's success last year and not looking at their losses and not looking at some of the wins. I think it was La Tech that they beat like 17-10 or something like that. Not looking at some of the wins and saying you very well could have lost to a really, really bad team. I do think it's a situation, if you remember back with Alabama in 2008 when it was like John Parker Wilson was throwing every ball to Julio Jones. That was it. So 2007 maybe. So they weren't a great team, but they had that connection. And when Debo Samuel went down, it really did take the wind out of the sails. But you're right, Hurst was a key part of that offense. And if you had both of them, then you had a little more dynamic offense, or a lot more dynamic offense. But Sky Moore is somebody that I was high on since he was a freshman, and I do think that's going to be a loss. I think that Muschamp's always going to field a good defense, but they can't get over the hurdle of the next tier, if that's a good way to put it. They're not going to jump up a tier until they can consistently perform on offense, and scoring 17 points offensively against anybody is not going to do it. So I agree with you. I've got South Carolina there, if I remember correctly, in your order, because I guess restate your order, because do you have South Carolina ahead of Kentucky or behind Kentucky?
I have South Carolina better than Kentucky.
Okay. So what's left then is Florida and Georgia. So why don't you go ahead and talk through that one? Because Florida's another pick for everybody thinking that Mullen's going to do just some instant magic there. What do you think?
So we've already discussed this separately at some length, but I like Florida this year. I think Mullen may turn that team around a lot faster than people think, just because, in particular, I look offensively and they have all of a sudden maybe the best set of receivers in the conference. Now, I don't know where they're at defensively. We talked a lot last year, right, that the linebackers at Florida are not very good. And a lot of their struggles came from the fact that I think we and I don't remember the exact stat off the top of my head, but it's like they hadn't had a linebacker starting in their defense that had been worse than 150th nationally as an overall player for 3 or 4 years, and all of a sudden they're starting guys like David Reese and Vasson Joseph that are not great. And some of those guys are, just average 3-star, not super highly rated players, and they played like it. It's a lack of talent defensively, and it's kind of shocking to see how really in a short period of time McElwain let the talent level at certain positions on that team fall off. So I don't know that they're going to take a huge step forward, but what I see offensively does give some reason to have a belief that they're going to take a step forward. I think they have maybe the best collection of skill players in the SEC East, and they finally have an offensive coordinator, or at least a head coach who was an offensive coordinator that knows how to score points on the team. So I could say them taking a pretty big jump. That said, and I know they lost players, and I understand the defense probably will not be nearly as good as they were last year. I think um, I have real concerns about how the offense is going to deal with the loss of those running backs, because I get that DeAndre Swift is a great player and all, but the combination of size, speed, and power that Chubb and Michelle brought to the table was incredible. I don't know how well Georgia's going to come back, but they're still a lot more talented, frankly, than anyone else in the conference,
Yeah,
and
and
I think
losing
they're
Zamir
a
White
tier
doesn't
better.
help either.
No, it really doesn't. But across the board, I still think they're more talented. And I'll step back before you say your comments and sort of explain it out. I don't necessarily rank them last to first in order. I put them in tiers. So if you were to say tiers 1 through tier 5, tier 5 I would have Tennessee and Vanderbilt. So that'd be the bottom tier of the conference. The next tier would be Kentucky and Missouri. The next tier would be Florida and South Carolina, and then the second tier would be Georgia. That maybe gives you a hint there where everybody landed, but I think everything's moving up. There was a time we've done these tier rankings in the past, and there was a time I think I had like one SEC East team in the top 3 tiers. Georgia was it, and then everybody else was 4th or 5th tier, and it was kind of sad. The SEC East is, I think, rapidly improving, but they're not quite there yet, and most of the teams have significant holes that they're going to need to be overcome.
So when you talk about Georgia, and obviously I think we're going to agree there too. I've got Georgia um, number 1 overall in the East, and I do think there's a big gap still. But I do think kind of what you alluded to with the East getting better, Georgia's got to take advantage right now to keep that recruiting heat, to keep that momentum going to where they can continue to separate themselves from the rest of the East. I am curious though. So given how the East, and I think the East is still bad. Like I don't think it's a good division at all. I think it's going to be bad this year. I think there's going to be some teams that surprise, and maybe Missouri puts something together offensively that's so good that they can challenge some people. But I think, tell me if you agree with this. I think Georgia is going to take a considerable step back from the team they were last year and still coast to an SEC championship. And I'll say this because not only the running backs and not only the defensive, they lost some pretty significant talent on the defensive side of the ball. I will say that Georgia last year represented a lot of seniors and a lot of leadership that stayed on that team, because it's the type of thing you get when you have a team that's good, not great, where they don't have the exposure to go pro early, even when they're really good. So they all hang around. Maybe artificially they get to that senior season. Maybe they get to that 4th year of playing where if they were on a better team, they might have gone pro early. So you had a top heavy senior laden leadership team that sort of powered them through. I think, long-winded circle back to you, I think Georgia takes a pretty significant step back this year, is still a good team, but because the East is so bad, they're still the clear and outright champion.
I would agree with that all around. And if you watched our show regularly last year, following the Notre Dame Georgia game, I think both of us came away incredibly impressed with Georgia. And we both, and you can go back and call us out on it, but I felt like coming out of the Notre Dame game that Georgia was a national title contender. And I was amazed at how much better they were overall. but it's going to be hard for them not to take a significant step back. But even taking a significant step back from being a national title contender still puts you at a different level than everybody else in the SEC East. I think Georgia still has the potential to make the playoff. I think they would still have a very good shot of making the SEC championship. I think they probably have a very good shot of making a Year 6 bowl game. This just probably isn't the year they make a national title run. And as you said last year, I think there's a lot of similarities between Georgia's season and what Auburn was able to do in 2010, in that Auburn that year had a lot of guys that were seniors that weren't necessarily exceptional talents, but were really, were solid players, and they had a ton of them. And that sort of cohesiveness made them solid all around. And then they had a couple guys that they could just lean on, particularly, Cam Newton, but also Nick Fairley defensively. And they sort of bludgeoned people, and they found ways to win every game. And a lot of games they would end up running away with. Georgia did the same thing, leaning on the running game last year. And there really wasn't anywhere you could attack where they weren't good. This year, they're still going to be more talented than everyone else, but they're probably not going to be sort of that solid play-to-play team they were. There's too many guys. Again, Chubb and Michelle were special, and I think Swift is a really good back and will become a really good back. But Chubb and Michelle could carry the load in every shape, form, and fashion every play. And Swift is going to give you a lot of pop and explosive potential, but every play isn't going to be a 6 or 7, 8 yard gain the way they were last year. And so you don't have that same consistency that lets you just pummel everybody. And they don't have the same consistent star power. I say star power, that's really not the right thing. I mean, Roquan Smith tackled anybody no matter where he was in the field, no matter what was happening. It was kind of incredible. And you're going to miss that. But even though you do miss that, you still have more talent than everyone else. You're still a better team than everyone else. And they're going to be good. They're going to turn it around. And I don't know. I think one of the interesting things with Georgia is, strangely, Jake Fromm comes into his own only to turn around, and you may have a truly exceptional talent in Justin Fields. And by the end of the year, we may be looking at Georgia team where Fields may well be the starter. It won't shock me because I thought he was absolutely incredible in their spring game. And, they may be a different team with Fields on the field at the end of the year. Still really good. Maybe they lose in the SEC championship and you go, wow, next year this team's going to be truly special when he takes command of the offense.
Yeah, and I've said the same. I've said that 2018 they take a step back. In 2019 they're probably the odds-on favorite for the national championship. It's because of how they've recruited. I think this step back will be hidden this year, partly because of the fact they traded Notre Dame on the road for a schedule of 3 nobodies in Georgia Tech for out of conference. And they draw LSU from the West. We're going to get into that in a minute, but I think you and I both, I haven't talked to you about LSU in a while, but I think you and I both are going to see them taking a step back. And then they've got Auburn. So if they sweep the East, sweep their horrible out of conference schedule, lose to Auburn, they're still 11-1. I mean, so I think they probably are looking at 11-1, 10-2 on a 9-win type team.